There are moments in history when a nation long ignored suddenly demands to be heard. Not with weapons, not with chaos, but with a simple act of building. That moment has arrived in Burkina Faso, a land once dismissed as poor, unstable, and dependent on outsiders. For decades, its name was rarely spoken in Washington or Brussels, except in reports about coups, hunger, or terrorism. To many in the West, it was just another forgotten African state. But today, the silence is broken, and the voice rising belongs to Ibrahim Traoré. In September 2022, a young artillery captain took the reins of leadership. He was not a politician shaped by foreign universities. He carried no colonial titles. What he carried instead was a vision that startled the world. From the very beginning, Captain Traoré declared that Burkina Faso would no longer kneel, not to foreign armies, not to financial institutions, not to empty promises wrapped in aid packages. His words were bold, but what followed proved even bolder. Within just a few years, projects began to appear across the nation. Air Burkina, the national airline once grounded, took to the skies again with new aircraft free from foreign debt. New hospitals rose to serve the elderly and the poor. Factories processing cashews and tomatoes began to replace dependency on imported goods. A national bank opened its doors to farmers and women entrepreneurs who had been excluded for generations. Even nuclear power entered the conversation as Burkina Faso signed agreements to pursue energy sovereignty. For the first time in living memory, ordinary citizens felt pride. A farmer who once begged for loans could now receive a tractor from the state. An elder who had been forgotten in rural villages could now look forward to proper medical care. A young graduate no longer saw emigration as the only path to a better life. These were not fairy tales told in speeches. They were real changes in daily life. Yet the most remarkable fact is not only what is being built, but what it represents. Each runway, each hospital bed, each bank account opened is a declaration. Africa bows to no one, and this message has not gone unnoticed. Across Africa, Traoré's projects inspire hope. In the West, they provoke unease. Could a small, landlocked country really shake the global balance of power? Could the vision of one young leader ignite a movement that changes Africa's place in the world? The answer begins with the projects themselves. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré spoke about sovereignty, many assumed it was only rhetoric. But in Burkina Faso, words became concrete, steel, and soil. The nation embarked on projects that only a few years earlier seemed impossible. Each one carried the same message: we will not wait for others to build our future. The first symbol of this transformation was in the skies. For years, Burkina Faso had no true control over its airways. Its national airline, Air Burkina, had collapsed under debt and mismanagement. But in October 2024, the airline lifted off again. A brand new Embraer E190 aircraft, valued at nearly $19 million, carried the flag of Burkina Faso across African skies. This was no borrowed plane with hidden conditions. It was secured through partnerships without foreign strings. To ordinary citizens, the sight of a Burkinabé plane in the air was more than transport. It was proof that their country could stand on its own wings. Expansion plans are already underway, with new terminals at Bobo Dioulasso and a massive international airport near Ouagadougou. One project alone is expected to handle more than 1.5 million passengers each year. Powered by solar energy, to avoid dependence on foreign grids. On the ground, the story continued in the fields. In early 2024, Traoré launched what he called the agro-pastoral offensive. Instead of speeches, the government delivered tools: 400 tractors, 700 motor pumps, and tens of thousands of tons of seed, fertilizer, and animal feed. A farmer in the province of Barcelona, holding the keys to a tractor for the first time, said simply, "Now my children will eat from the land their father tills." Alongside these tools came education. Young people were trained with 2 hectares of land each, irrigation and real practice, preparing them not just to farm, but to build a sovereign food economy. Industry was not left behind. An $11 million cashew processing plant opened with the capacity to employ 20,000 workers, potentially growing to 50,000. No longer would raw cashews be shipped to Europe only to return in glossy packages. Now the value, the jobs, and the pride would stay in Burkina Faso. In Bobo Dioulasso, local investors built a tomato factory that can process 100 tons each day. Behind every can of tomato paste is more than profit. It is a statement: we will feed ourselves. Finance, often the most guarded tool of foreign influence, also changed. In October 2024, Burkina Faso opened Postbank with 15 billion CFA francs in capital. For the first time, farmers, small businesses, and women entrepreneurs could access loans without being trapped by foreign banks or predatory lenders. A woman in Tinkodogo used her first loan to open a tailoring workshop. A student in Bobo saved for education abroad. Finance had come down from the glass towers and entered the hands of ordinary citizens. Healthcare followed close behind. For decades, the elderly in Burkina Faso lived with little support. In 2025, the government launched the nation's first hospital dedicated to geriatrics, backed by nearly 2 billion CFA francs. More than 95,000 retirees now receive free annual checkups and vouchers for medicine. To an older farmer, who once had to choose between food and treatment, this was not just policy, it was dignity. Meanwhile, new hospitals in Pala and Gawa expanded access to advanced procedures once thought impossible within the country. Mobile clinics reached rural areas, ensuring that even the poorest could see a doctor without traveling hundreds of miles. Energy, the foundation of all progress, also saw bold moves. In June 2025, Burkina Faso signed a strategic cooperation agreement with Russia's nuclear agency to pursue peaceful nuclear energy. This step, combined with new solar farms in Zagtuli and Zina, is bringing electricity to communities that had lived in darkness for generations. Between 2020 and 2023, only about 20% of the population had access to reliable power. Today, that number is rising. A child studying by a lamp powered by the sun, a nurse switching on lights in a rural clinic, a mechanic recharging an electric vehicle built in Ouagadougou. These are the signs that power is no longer a luxury, but a right. The story of these projects is not limited to statistics or blueprints. It is a story of people. A mother receiving free treatment for the first time. A young man training as a pilot in a reborn national airline. A seamstress who no longer has to borrow money from loan sharks. A retired worker who finally walks into a hospital designed for elders. Each of them is a thread in the larger fabric of a nation reclaiming control of its destiny. But projects are not just about building. They carry meaning. They are declarations written in concrete and steel that Burkina Faso will not be defined by dependency. This is why the world is watching closely. For every runway completed, for every factory that opens, the balance of influence shifts. Cliffhanger. The people celebrate, yet in Washington and Paris there is unease. If Burkina Faso can achieve this much in just a few years, what will it mean for Western influence in Africa tomorrow? Every great story of change reaches a moment when the emotions of a people overflow. In Burkina Faso, that moment came not through war, but through building. As new planes flew, factories opened, and hospitals rose, the pride of ordinary citizens reached levels unseen for generations. What had been dismissed as a dream was now concrete, steel, and living proof. On the streets of Ouagadougou, a group of students gathered as Air Burkina's new Embraer lifted into the sky. Many had never flown before, but they cheered as if they were on board. "This is not just a plane," one student said. "It is our dignity flying." That same week, a farmer in Barcelogo received his first tractor under the agro-pastoral program. His children climbed onto the machine, laughing as their father said, "For the first time, I can feed my family with my own strength." These were not isolated scenes. They became symbols repeated across the countryside. The opening of the tomato factory in Bobo Dioulasso was another powerful moment. For years, farmers sold their tomatoes for almost nothing, watching them rot when buyers failed to come. Now, every truckload delivered to the factory meant income, stability, and hope. One cooperative leader said, "We are no longer exporting our hunger. We are feeding ourselves." Similar stories spread from the cashew processing plant, where young men and women found steady employment. For many families, it was the first time multiple generations had work in the same community. Healthcare projects carried their own emotional weight. At the new geriatric hospital, elders who had been forgotten were welcomed with respect. One retired teacher, now receiving free medical checkups, said softly, "For years I felt invisible. Today, I feel seen." Families across the nation repeated that sentiment. When mobile clinics arrived in rural villages, mothers carried children on their backs, whispering thanks that they no longer had to travel for hours to find basic care. In these quiet moments, the promise of sovereignty was not political theory. It was personal. The emotional impact extended beyond individuals to the collective spirit of the people. Stadiums, once dark and crumbling, now filled with cheering crowds. Social housing projects replaced slums with permanent homes. New banks welcomed customers who had been excluded for decades. Everywhere, there was a sense of rebirth. For the first time in decades, people spoke of Burkina Faso not as a place of despair, but as a land of possibility. The reaction was not limited to Burkina Faso. Across Africa, observers called Traore a new Sankara, a young leader reviving the dream of dignity and independence. In Mali and Niger, young activists waved Burkinabé flags and chanted slogans about sovereignty. On African podcasts and social media, commentators said, "If Burkina Faso can rise, why not us?" The projects became a source of continental pride, a spark for broader movements demanding accountability and independence. Yet not everyone celebrated. In Western capitals, analysts warned that Burkina Faso's partnerships with Russia and China could redraw the map of influence in Africa. French commentators expressed concern that gold refineries and cement plants run by local and Asian partners meant the end of decades of economic dominance. American policy circles questioned whether a stronger, more independent Burkina Faso would undermine counter-terrorism cooperation in the Sahel. What looked like progress in Ouagadougou looked like disruption in Washington and Paris. The tension was amplified by symbolism. When Traoré stood before crowds declaring, "Burkina Faso will no longer kneel," it was not just a speech. It was a direct challenge to systems of dependency that had lasted for generations. To many Africans, those words were liberation. To Western powers, they sounded like rebellion. The clash of narratives intensified online. Hashtags celebrating Burkina Faso's sovereignty spread rapidly, while Western news outlets highlighted concerns about stability and governance. Opinion polls in the diaspora showed overwhelming support for Traoré's vision, but in European parliaments debates grew about whether sanctions or diplomatic pressure might be needed to slow his momentum. Inside Burkina Faso, however, the momentum was undeniable. Ordinary citizens were living the change, and that mattered more than outside opinions. Families moved into new homes. Farmers delivered crops to local factories. Elders received medical care with dignity. Students trained with tools instead of empty promises. Every story built a larger truth. Burkina Faso was no longer waiting for the world's approval. It was acting on its own. And so the question shifted from, "Can it be done?" to "What happens next?" For citizens, hope was enough. For neighboring nations, inspiration was powerful. But for Western powers, the transformation of Burkina Faso carried uncomfortable implications. If a small nation once dismissed as irrelevant can build this much in only a few years, what might it mean for America and its allies, who have long shaped Africa's destiny? The ripple effects of Ibrahim Traoré's projects went far beyond construction sites and government speeches. They began to reshape daily life, altering how families lived, how communities worked, and how citizens thought about their country. In a land long associated with hardship, hope was no longer a distant dream. It was visible in concrete houses, in factory gates opening, and in hospitals welcoming patients who once had no place to go. For ordinary people, the most immediate impact was economic. Thousands of new jobs appeared across industries. At the cashew processing plant, young women who once relied on small street markets found steady employment, regular income, and independence. In Bobo Dioulasso, truck drivers who used to make risky trips across borders now carried tomatoes to a local factory that paid fair prices. A father of 3 said, "For the first time, I know that my children will not go to bed hungry." These changes were not only about wages, they were about dignity, about citizens finally feeling that their work built their own nation instead of filling foreign warehouses. Agriculture, too, experienced a shift. With tractors and irrigation systems provided under the agro-pastoral offensive, farmers saw higher yields and greater stability. No longer dependent solely on seasonal rains, they could plan for the future. Youth who once left villages for uncertain lives in cities or abroad began to return, seeing agriculture as a viable path. A university graduate in Barcelona explained, "I was planning to migrate to Europe. Now I am staying because farming has become a business worth pursuing." Migration pressures, long a burden for Burkina Faso and Europe alike, began to ease. Healthcare improvements touched another layer of society. Elders who had been forgotten suddenly became visible again. With a hospital dedicated to geriatrics and policies guaranteeing free annual checkups for nearly 100,000 retirees, families could care for their parents with pride instead of shame. A grandmother receiving medicine vouchers in Ouagadougou put it simply, "I am old, but my country has not abandoned me." These moments reshaped how communities viewed government, not as a distant force, but as a partner in their daily lives. Politically, the effects were profound. Traore, a young leader in his 30s, represented a break from the old guard of African politics. By delivering visible results, he gained legitimacy not from foreign approval, but from popular support. Opposition voices struggled to challenge him because citizens could see real benefits. Homes built, power grids expanding, factories hiring. Trust, long eroded by corruption and failed promises, began to return. People who had once shouted in the streets now worked on construction sites or enrolled in new training programs. This popular support also gave Traoré leverage against internal elites and foreign actors who sought to pressure his government. Military officers who once held disproportionate power now found themselves overshadowed by the energy of civilian projects. Ministers who delayed progress risked being replaced. The message was clear: loyalty to the people, not to old structures, would define Burkina Faso's future. Beyond national borders, the impact spread through the Sahel. In Mali and Niger, leaders watched closely, seeing how Traoré's strategy could reinforce their own moves toward sovereignty. Activists across West Africa cited Burkina Faso's factories and hospitals as proof that dependency was not inevitable. The idea that African nations could feed themselves, power their homes, and manage their resources without waiting for Western aid gained strength. A Malian commentator said on radio, "If Burkina Faso can do this, we have no excuse not to follow." At the same time, the rapid transformation carried risks. International institutions warned that financing such large projects could strain the fragile economy. Opposition figures worried that over-centralization of power might weaken democratic checks. Some citizens voiced concerns about whether the government could sustain these initiatives long-term. Yet for most, these doubts were outweighed by the visible progress in their lives. As one construction worker put it, "We are finally moving forward. That is enough for now." The political landscape itself began to shift. Instead of constant instability and coups, the new narrative centered on productivity and sovereignty. Regional cooperation between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger deepened, with discussions of joint infrastructure projects and shared security initiatives. Western diplomats grew uneasy as the Sahel bloc became less dependent on traditional partners. But within Africa, the sense of pride was undeniable. The greatest consequence, however, was psychological. For generations, Burkinabé people were told that their country was too small, too poor, too unstable to control its destiny. Now, they were living proof that change was possible. A young teacher in Ouagadougou summed it up best. "We used to teach our children that the future was elsewhere. Now we tell them, the future is here." Yet as Burkina Faso strengthens its independence, questions grow in Washington and European capitals. Could these projects, born in one of Africa's smallest nations, alter the balance of global power? And how far will the West go to protect its interests? From Washington to Paris, the rise of Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré has been watched with a mixture of surprise, concern, and even quiet alarm. For decades, the Sahel region was seen through the lens of Western security interests. American troops operated from bases in nearby Niger. French companies extracted gold and uranium, and international banks dictated the terms of development. Burkina Faso, once considered too dependent to chart its own course, is now rewriting that script. In Washington, policymakers worry about what this means for security. The United States has long argued that its presence in the Sahel is vital for counterterrorism. But when a small nation like Burkina Faso turns toward Russia for nuclear energy cooperation and China for construction support, questions arise. Can the U.S. still rely on these governments as partners against extremist threats? Or will they pivot entirely toward new alliances that sideline American influence? Behind closed doors, some defense officials warn that a weakened American footprint in West Africa could create gaps that others will quickly fill. For France, the shock is even more personal. French companies once controlled large portions of Burkina Faso's mining and infrastructure sectors. Today, gold is refined at local facilities, cement is produced in national plants, and even clothing for soldiers is made from traditional fabrics rather than imported second-hand goods. Each of these steps cuts into profits once guaranteed to French industries. Newspapers in Paris frame Traoré's policies as reckless nationalism, but many Africans see them as long overdue justice. The broader world, however, does not speak with one voice. The African Union has praised Burkina Faso's emphasis on sovereignty and local production. Leaders in Mali and Niger, now aligned with Ouagadougou, point to these projects as proof that regional independence is not just possible, but necessary. On social media, diaspora communities across the Atlantic cheer every new factory and hospital, seeing them as a rebirth of dignity long denied. For older Americans watching these developments, the implications are worth reflection. If Africa no longer depends on Western loans, aid, and food imports, what will that mean for U.S. policy and global stability? If nations once seen as weak begin to stand tall, will America respond with respect or with resistance? These questions matter because they touch not only on strategy, but on values. Should the United States support nations seeking dignity, even if it reduces Western influence, or should it fight to preserve the old order? And so the stage is set for a larger question. Is Burkina Faso's transformation the beginning of a new African order that Washington cannot control, or is it simply a passing chapter in the long struggle for independence? The answer leads us to the heart of this story, what it means for the future of Africa itself. The story of Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traoré is not just about airports, factories, or banks. It is about a nation reclaiming dignity and refusing to be defined by dependency. Yet the road ahead is not without danger. A country that dares to stand tall often faces storms. Pressure from powerful nations, economic challenges, and security threats may still test the strength of this new direction. The question is whether Burkina Faso can hold its ground long enough to turn vision into permanence. Across Africa, the ripple effects are already visible. From Mali to Niger, people speak of sovereignty as if it were a seed planted in their own soil. Leaders in distant capitals watch with unease, knowing that one small nation's success could inspire many others to break free from old systems of control. This is why the world is paying attention, because what began in Ouagadougou could reshape the future of an entire continent. But will this moment endure? History reminds us that hope can be fragile. If regional alliances fail to grow stronger in the coming months, Burkina Faso could find itself standing alone. If foreign powers choose to intervene directly or indirectly, the progress of these projects could be slowed, even reversed. Yet if unity holds, if neighbors stand together, then this small landlocked country might prove that dignity can outlast intimidation. So the larger question remains, is Ibrahim Traoré building a foundation for Africa's future, or has he only opened a brief window of defiance that may close under outside pressure? Will sovereignty take root deeply enough to survive the storms ahead, or will it fade into another chapter of lost opportunities? If this story has made you pause and reflect, let your heart be part of the conversation. If you believe in justice, in dignity, and in a rising Africa, share these thoughts with others. If you believe that nations, like families, deserve the right to stand on their own feet, then do not let this story end here. May God bless those who choose to build rather than beg, and may He bless a continent that is daring to rise again.